You ever get that feeling? That feeling when the cold sinks so deep into your bones, you forget what it's like to be warm? That was Catherine Miller's world in the winter of 1887. The Montana wilderness doesn't care about your hopes or your dreams. It just is. And that night, it was a frozen hell of dagger-sharp snowflakes and a wind that wanted to peel the skin from her face. Every step was a battle. Knee-deep snow fought her, tried to pull her down and bury her for good. Her coat, a thin, threadbare memory of a life she once knew, was a joke against the cold. A smear of frozen blood was cracked on her chin from a lip split hours ago. Her eye was swollen shut, a purple and black monument to a man's rage. But the pain was nothing. The cold was nothing. The real monster was behind her, and he was coming. The howl of hunting dogs echoed through the valley, a sound that promised a brutal end. It was the sound of her husband, Thomas Miller, a man whose charming letters had painted a picture of a frontier paradise, but whose fists had painted a different reality on her skin. She had gambled everything on this desperate run for freedom. She knew it might cost her everything, but dying out here, alone in the vast, white silence, seemed 1,000 times better than one more day, one more night under Thomas Miller's roof. What Catherine couldn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine as she stumbled through the darkness, was that she wasn't alone in these mountains. Someone else was moving through the trees, a shadow against the snow. Someone whose story of loss was about to crash into hers. Someone whose knowledge of this unforgiving land would be her only hope. But was he a friend, or just another monster waiting in the dark? 3 months earlier, Catherine Bennett had been a different person in a different world. She was a seamstress in Boston, 23 years old, her world smelling of chalk and fabric and the dim light of her boarding house room. Her fingers, nimble and quick, could turn a bolt of cloth into a dress that would make the middle-class women of the city feel like queens. But the pay was a pittance. Barely enough for rent, barely enough for food, and definitely not enough for what her sister, Sarah, needed. The late March rain tapped a lonely rhythm against her window. Her eyes were tired, strained from hours of tiny stitches. Her gaze fell on the newspaper folded beside her sewing basket. An advertisement, circled in ink, seemed to call out to her. Successful Montana rancher seeks respectable Eastern lady for matrimony. Comfortable home and prosperous future guaranteed. She'd seen ads like this before. She'd seen other girls from the boarding house pack their bags with hopeful smiles, only to read their letters months later, letters that spoke of dirt floors, back-breaking work, and lonely, bitter nights. But Sarah's cough was getting worse. The doctor used a word that terrified Catherine: consumption. The treatment costs were a mountain she couldn't climb on a seamstress's wage. Desperation makes you look at things differently. It makes you circle advertisements in newspapers. So she wrote a letter, and the reply that came back from a Mr. Thomas Miller felt like a prayer answered. His handwriting was elegant, his words poetic. He wrote of 200 acres of fertile land, a 2-story home with real glass windows, orchards, cattle, and hired hands to manage the heavy labor. But it was one line that sealed Catherine's fate. He promised her sister would be welcome. He wrote of the clean mountain air that would heal her lungs. You won't be just a wife, his third letter assured her, but a partner. A partner in building something meaningful in this magnificent country. He seemed to understand everything. Her fears for Sarah, her dreams of a life bigger than a Boston boarding house. He was patient. He was kind. He was everything she needed. We'll make this decision together, Sarah had whispered, her voice weak but firm as they read his letters aloud. Sarah was younger, but she had a wisdom that felt ancient. If anything feels wrong, Catherine, we'll find another way. But nothing felt wrong, not until they stepped off the train in Billings, Montana. He was there, just as he'd promised. Catherine recognized him from the small photograph he'd sent. Broad shoulders, a neat beard, steady eyes. But the man striding toward them was a stranger. The warmth from his letters was gone, replaced by a cold, assessing gaze that swept over Catherine like a rancher inspecting livestock. Then his eyes landed on Sarah, frail and coughing beside her sister, and they narrowed with undisguised annoyance. You didn't mention she was this far gone, he said. Those were his first words. Not hello, not welcome. A complaint directed at Catherine as if Sarah wasn't even there. A chill, colder than the autumn air, snaked its way down Catherine's spine. The journey was difficult, she said, her voice tight. She'll be better with some rest. Thomas just grunted and gestured toward a battered, weather-beaten wagon. It's a full day's ride to the ranch. Let's move. The ranch. That was the next lie. It wasn't 30 miles from Billings. It was a 12-hour journey into a narrow, shadowed valley that felt like the edge of the world. The grand two-story house was a rough-hewn cabin with a leaky roof and a loft you reached by a rickety ladder. The orchards were 3 pathetic, struggling apple trees. The cattle were 8 bony cows. And the hired hands? There was only Thomas and his 14-year-old son William, a sullen, silent boy who looked at Catherine and Sarah with pure, uncut hatred. "Where are the other buildings?" Catherine asked, her heart sinking as he dumped their trunks in the mud. "Had to sell that portion," he mumbled without looking at her. "Bad winter last year." It wasn't a bad winter. It was a lie, all of it. And as the cabin door slammed shut behind them, plunging them into the smoky gloom, Catherine felt the trap close around them. The beautiful dream had vanished. The nightmare was just beginning. The cabin was a cage of smoke and drafts. Every gust of wind seemed to find a new crack in the walls, carrying a chill that went straight for Sarah's weakened lungs. Her cough, once a gentle punctuation to her sentences, became a violent, racking spasm that left her breathless and pale. "She needs a doctor," Catherine pleaded on their 8th night, as Sarah's fever began to climb. Thomas didn't even look up from his plate of greasy bacon. "Nearest doctor's in Billings. Too far. Snow's coming." "Then medicine. Something for the fever." Catherine's voice was sharp with a fear that was quickly turning to anger. "Trading post might have something," he grunted. "I'll go tomorrow." He left the next day. He was gone for 3. When he returned, there was no medicine, just the sour stink of whiskey on his breath. "They were out," was all he said, his eyes daring her to question him further. That night was the first time he truly showed her the man he was. After Sarah had finally drifted into a fitful, feverish sleep, Thomas gestured toward the lumpy mattress they were supposed to share. It was a matrimonial right he had claimed the very first night, ignoring her pleas for time to adjust. A bruise on her wrist from that night was a constant, ugly reminder of their arrangement. But tonight, with Sarah so sick, Catherine couldn't. "My sister might need me," she said, planting her feet by Sarah's bedside. His face darkened, the charming mask from the letters melting away to reveal the monster beneath. "Your sister's dying," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Nothing you can do. Your place is with your husband. Please, Thomas, just for tonight. She's burning up." His hand moved so fast she didn't see it coming. A bright explosion of pain erupted on her cheek, and she stumbled backward, knocking over the pitcher of water she'd placed by Sarah's bed. The crash echoed in the suffocating silence. "You seem to have forgotten," he hissed, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "I paid for your passage. I put a roof over your head. You owe me." It was in that moment, seeing the cold calculation in his eyes, that she understood. There had never been a prosperous ranch. There had never been any hope of clean mountain air for Sarah. He had written to dozens of women, painting the same false picture, luring them to this isolated prison. How many had come before her? And what had happened to them? She didn't fight him that night. She couldn't. But as he snored beside her, a dead weight reeking of whiskey, she made a vow. She would get herself and Sarah out of this hell, or she would die trying. The chance never came for Sarah. She was gone within 3 weeks. Thomas had reluctantly paid for a cheap pine coffin, but refused to buy a proper grave marker. "Wood rots," he said, kicking a clump of dirt onto the fresh mound behind the cabin. "No point wasting money." After that, Catherine became a ghost. She cooked. She cleaned. She endured Thomas's nightly demands with a cold, dead emptiness inside her. Her silence seemed to enrage him more than her arguments ever had. The cruelty escalated. A slap for stew that was too salty. A shove for a shirt that wasn't mended perfectly. William, his son, watched it all with a disturbing, quiet satisfaction. Sometimes he would even smirk. With Sarah gone, Catherine's reason for enduring had vanished. Now she had a new reason to survive. Justice. She started to plan. She watched him. She noticed the small lockbox he kept under their bed. Pretending to be asleep, she watched through slitted eyes as he counted the money inside. Not much, but enough. She noted the rifle he kept loaded by the door, the snowshoes in the shed, the harnesses in the barn, and she observed his routine. Every third Saturday, he and William rode to a neighboring homestead for cards and moonshine. They never came back before dawn. 4 months after her arrival, on the third Saturday of January, Catherine served them dinner. She added a generous dose of the laudanum the doctor had prescribed for Sarah's final, agonizing days into their coffee. Just enough to make them sleepy. Just enough to make sure their card game ended early. As their horses disappeared into the darkness, she moved like a woman possessed. She gathered food, Sarah's warm shawl, and the three $20 bills she had painstakingly stolen from the lockbox, one at a time, over several weeks. She layered her clothes, pulling on one of Thomas's wool shirts and a coat over her own dress. Then she slipped out to the barn. Her plan was simple. Take a horse, ride west to Idaho. There was a settlement 3 days away. If she could just reach it. "Pa's gonna kill you for this." The voice sliced through the snowy silence. It was William. He was standing by the cabin door, holding his father's hunting rifle, and it was aimed directly at her heart. "William." Catherine's voice was impossibly calm, a strange island of stillness in the ocean of her racing heart. "Put the gun down. Just let me go. By the time he wakes up, I'll be long gone." The boy, barely a man, sneered. The rifle barrel didn't waver. "You think I'm stupid? He'd beat me half to death if I let you steal his horse. Get back inside, now." She measured the distance, 20 yards. The boy was used to the rifle. She'd seen him hunt, but it looked heavy in his hands. "William, listen to me," she said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "Your father." "Shut up!" His voice cracked, a boy's voice trying to sound like a man's. "You're not my mother. You don't get to talk to me." "I know I'm not," she said, her voice softening. "But I think I understand why she left." It was a wild guess. Thomas had only ever said his first wife was gone, but the flash of pure fury that contorted William's face told her she'd hit a nerve, a raw, festering nerve. "She didn't leave," the boy snarled, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. "She ran, just like you're trying to do. Pa caught her, though." He took a step closer, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Pa always catches what belongs to him." The meaning behind his words was a shard of ice in her gut. She wasn't the first, and the first one hadn't gotten away. This wasn't just about escape anymore. This was about survival. She had to make a choice. Right now. She let the horse's reins drop and slowly raised her hands. "You're right, William. I shouldn't leave. Let's go inside and wait for your father." For a second it worked. A flicker of confusion, of teenage arrogance, crossed his face. His grip on the rifle loosened just a fraction. It was all she needed. She lunged. She dove under the barrel, shoving it upward as the world exploded in a deafening roar. The shot blasted into the night sky as they crashed together in the snow. He was strong, wiry, and fueled by years of pent-up rage. He slammed the rifle butt into her face. Pain blossomed across her cheek, hot and blinding. She tasted blood. But desperation gives you a strength you never knew you had. She twisted, wrenched the rifle from his grasp, and it clattered into the snow between them. She didn't hesitate. She drove her knee upward with all her might. He gasped and doubled over. She grabbed the rifle not to shoot but to swing, a heavy, solid club against the side of his head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious, breathing. She stood over him, shaking, the terrible reality of what she'd just done washing over her. The shot. Someone would have heard it. She had minutes, at most. She abandoned the plan to go west. Thomas would expect that. She scrambled onto the horse bareback and kicked it into motion, heading east, deeper into the unforgiving wilderness of the Beartooth Mountains. It was a suicide mission in the dead of winter, but it was her only chance. As she glanced back one last time, she saw William stirring in the snow. Their eyes met across the distance, and she knew. The hunt was on. For 3 days, she pushed on. The horse eventually gave out, and she left it, whispering an apology before stumbling forward on foot. The world was a white, featureless blur. She was lost. The cold was a physical thing, a monster gnawing at her fingers and toes. Then she heard it, faint at first, then closer. The baying of hounds. Thomas had found the horse. He was on her trail. Panic gave her a final burst of adrenaline. She ran, stumbled, fell, and got up again, her lungs burning, her mind screaming. As dusk fell on the third day, her body finally gave out. She collapsed at the edge of a frozen creek, the barking of the dogs seeming to come from right behind her. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she whispered to the swirling snow. "I tried." Darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before the world went black was a shadow, a figure moving toward her. Too tall for a wolf, too silent for Thomas. A human shape, wrapped in furs, appearing out of the blizzard like a spirit. And then, nothing. Warmth. That was the first thing she felt. A gentle, penetrating warmth that seemed to thaw her from the inside out. She was wrapped in soft, heavy furs. The air smelled of wood smoke and strange, earthy herbs. A low, rhythmic humming sound vibrated through the floor. She tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids were made of lead. When she finally managed, she saw she was in some kind of lodge. The walls made of animal hide stretched over a wooden frame. A small fire crackled in the center. She tried to sit up, and a groan escaped her lips. The humming stopped. A figure moved out of the shadows and into the firelight. It was the man from the snow. He was maybe 35, with copper skin and eyes so sharp and observant, they seemed to see right through her. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jawline. "You wake," he said. His English was accented but clear. "Good. 3 days you sleep." 3 days. Thomas would have scoured these mountains. The man with the dogs. She rasped, her throat dry. He immediately brought her a water skin, helping her drink. "He went north yesterday," the man said. "He thinks you crossed the river." "How?" she whispered. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I carried you across the river. Then I walked in the river for 2 miles before coming here. Old hunting lodge. No one comes here." She knew who he was, from the patterns on the containers around the lodge. "You're Sioux," she said. He nodded once. "Lakota. My name is Daniel Takes Horse." Daniel. The Christian name surprised her. A shadow crossed his face. "At the mission school, they called me Daniel. Said my Lakota name was not good for God's ears. My people know me as Macpia Luda." Red cloud. "Catherine," she told him. "Catherine Miller." "Catherine," he pronounced it carefully. "The man hunting you. He is your husband." She looked away, shame washing over her. "Yes." He simply nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "Rest now," he said. "When you are stronger, we talk." For the next few days, she drifted in and out of a healing sleep. Every time she woke, Daniel was there, offering broth or a strange pine needle tea that soothed her ragged lungs. He tended to her injuries with a gentle efficiency. The frostbite was minor, but her face was a mess of bruises from William's attack. On the 6th day after her escape, she finally felt strong enough to sit up on her own. He had just returned with a rabbit for their dinner. "You look better," he observed. "Thanks to you," she said, pulling the fur robes tighter. "I owe you my life." He began skinning the rabbit with practiced, precise movements. "All life is connected. I help you. One day, maybe you help another." As the stew simmered over the fire, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why? Why did you help me? You risked everything for a white woman." He was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of pain. "6 winters ago," he began, "I had a wife, Morning Star, and a daughter, Emma. We lived on the reservation. The government men said we had to live in square houses, send our children to their schools." His gaze went distant. "Emma got sick at the school. The coughing sickness. She died." Catherine's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Morning Star's spirit broke. When spring came, she walked into the Black Hills and did not return. He looked directly at Catherine then, and his eyes were filled with a sorrow so deep it was bottomless. I know what it is to lose the heart of your world. When I saw you in the snow, I saw her. No one should die alone in the cold. His simple, honest compassion was a shock. After months of Thomas Miller's lies and cruelty, it felt like drinking cool water after a lifetime of thirst. After she was gone, he continued, I left the reservation, came back to the mountains where my people once hunted. The army calls me a hostile for leaving. But I make no war. I just live. Now she understood. The mix of traditional clothes and army-issue pants. The lodge that was a blend of two worlds. He was a man caught between them, choosing this lonely freedom over a slow death of the soul. What will you do now? He asked, stirring the stew. The question hung in the air. She couldn't go back. Thomas would find her. She had nothing, no one. You could stay, Daniel said, as if reading her mind. Until spring. The offer was a lifeline, but it was also a risk, for both of them. Thomas won't stop looking, she said. He considers me his property. He and the boy searched for 3 more days, Daniel reported calmly. Then they went back. Today I saw Miller in the valley with another man, a man with a tin star on his chest. A marshal. Thomas had brought the law into it, but the way Daniel said it, the look in his eyes sent a new wave of fear through her. They went north, Daniel continued, pointing in the opposite direction from their lodge. But they will be back. He looked at her, his expression grim. The marshal. He does not search like a man looking for a lost woman. He searches like a man hunting an animal for a bounty. The trap she had escaped was bigger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just her husband hunting her anymore. It was the law itself. The weeks that followed were a blur of learning and healing. As her body recovered, her mind sharpened. Daniel became her teacher. He taught her the silent language of the forest, how to read the story of a bent twig, a faint track in the snow, the call of a distant bird. He showed her how to set snares, how to tan hides, how to find food where it seemed only snow and rock existed. Her hands, once soft from needlework, grew calloused and strong. She was becoming someone new, someone tougher. Daniel, in turn, seemed to thaw in her presence. The deep well of his loneliness began to fill with their shared work and quiet companionship. He never pushed her to talk about Thomas, but one evening, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside their sanctuary, she told him everything. The letters, the lies, Sarah's death, the escape. He listened, his face an unreadable mask in the firelight, his fingers methodically sharpening a knife. When she finished, the only sound was the scraping of stone on steel. This Thomas Miller, he said, his voice a low growl. He has a reputation. 3 winters ago, he shot a Lakota boy, claimed he was stealing a horse. The boy was 14. The knife in his hand was still. The agent at the reservation did nothing. The marshal in Billings said it was justified. Miller walked free. So the marshal wasn't just helping Thomas. He was his friend, his accomplice. He'll never stop, Catherine whispered. It's his pride. He can't let a woman, his property, get away. Daniel set the knife down. Spring will come, he said. The snow will melt. You will have to choose. Run far away or... He trailed off, his eyes holding hers. Or what? Or fight back. The idea was insane. A lone woman and a hostile Indian against a wealthy landowner and a corrupt lawman? But the thought took root in the barren ground of her despair. It was a tiny, impossible seed of hope. One crisp March morning, their world shattered. They were checking a fish trap by a frozen lake when Daniel froze, his hands shooting out to signal for silence. A moment later, she heard it too, the crack of a branch under a heavy boot. Daniel pointed to a ridge a half-mile away. 2 figures, silhouetted against the snow. Miller, he whispered, and the marshal. Fear, cold and familiar, clawed at her throat. They were closer than ever before. They have followed our tracks, Daniel said, his voice grim. The warmer weather has made the trail clear. They scrambled for cover behind a fallen log, their hearts pounding in unison. They watched as Miller and the marshal surveyed the valley below, their movements methodical, predatory. They will find the lodge by midday, Daniel calculated, his mind working furiously. We must move. Now. Where can we go? Catherine breathed, her mind reeling. Higher. Into the mountains. I have a summer camp near a sacred lake, a place no white man has found. They raced back to the lodge, their minds a whirlwind of panicked efficiency. They packed only the essentials: knives, fire starters, jerky, furs. Every second counted. As they prepared to leave, Daniel paused, holding up a small, leather-bound book. I found this, he said, his voice heavy, hidden under a loose floorboard in the cabin. It was a diary. Catherine's blood ran cold as she recognized the elegant, looping script. It wasn't hers. It belonged to Elizabeth Miller, Thomas's first wife, the one who had run off. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The entry started with hope, mirroring her own letters. Then came confusion, then fear, then pure, unadulterated terror. The final entry was short, scribbled in a frantic, shaky hand. He knows I know about the others, the women from the advertisements. He is coming up the stairs. William is with him. He is smiling. God help me. Catherine looked up at Daniel, her eyes wide with horror. Elizabeth hadn't run, and she wasn't the only one. Thomas wasn't just a bully. He was a monster who collected wives like trophies and discarded them when he was done. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air. Not the wind, not the baying of hounds. The sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle. A bullet splintered the wood of the lodge door, inches from Catherine's head. They had been seen. The hunt was over. The trap was sprung. The window! Daniel yelled, shoving her toward the back of the lodge, where a small opening, covered by a stretched hide, served as a crude window. Another shot ripped through the wall. Splinters flew past her face. They weren't trying to capture her. They were trying to kill her. Daniel returned fire with his own rifle, the deafening blast filling the small space. It wasn't a warning shot. He was aiming to stop them. Catherine scrambled out the window, landing in a deep snowdrift that cushioned her fall. The cold was a shock, but the adrenaline was a fire in her veins. Daniel followed a second later, grabbing her hand. This way, to the rocks! They ran, zigzagging through the trees as bullets whizzed past them, thudding into tree trunks with sickening finality. Miller and the corrupt marshal, a man named Brand, were closing in, their shouts echoing through the quiet forest. They reached a jumble of massive boulders, a natural fortress that offered temporary cover. Daniel pushed her behind the largest rock and took a position where he could watch their approach. They will try to circle us, he said, his breath coming in ragged clouds. Brand is a tracker. Miller is just a killer. Catherine peeked around the edge of the rock. She could see them now, two dark figures, moving cautiously through the trees. Miller held a rifle, Brand a pistol. This was it, a fight to the death in the middle of the frozen wilderness. But something was wrong. There weren't two figures. There were three. The third was smaller, slighter, moving with a youthful, almost hesitant gait. It was William. Thomas had brought his son on the hunt, the boy who had tried to stop her, the boy she had knocked unconscious. Did he want revenge? Or was he just a puppet, his father pulling the strings? Stay here, Daniel commanded, his eyes fixed on their pursuers. I will lead them away. Draw their fire. When you have a clear path, run for the high pass. Do not stop. No! Catherine grabbed his arm. I'm not leaving you. This is not a choice, he said, his voice hard. One of us must survive. To tell the story, to see justice done. You have the diary. He pressed Elizabeth's journal into her hands. Now go! Before she could argue, he broke cover, firing a shot into the trees above Miller's head and sprinting in the opposite direction. He's over here! Miller bellowed, and he and Brand immediately gave chase, firing wildly. It was the chance she needed. A clear path, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Run and live, or stay and fight? The ghost of Sarah, the memory of Elizabeth, the face of the man who had just saved her life again. They all swirled in her mind. She looked down at the diary in her hand. He knows I know about the others. Elizabeth's words screamed at her from the page. This wasn't just about her survival. It was about all of them. She looked back at the chase. Daniel was a ghost in the trees, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay just ahead of them. But it wouldn't last. They were two guns against his one. And then she saw William. He wasn't following his father. He was hanging back, his face a mask of confusion and fear. He hadn't fired a single shot. An idea, desperate and insane, formed in her mind. She didn't run for the pass. She ran toward William. She moved silently, using the cover of the trees just as Daniel had taught her. She circled around, coming up behind the boy. He was staring after his father, his rifle held loosely at his side. "William," she whispered. He spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He raised the rifle, but his hands were trembling. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Look at him, William. He's not just a hard man. He's a monster. You know what he did to your mother." "He said she ran away," the boy choked out, tears freezing on his cheeks. "He lied," Catherine said, holding out the diary. "Your mother's words, William. Read them. Read the last thing she ever wrote." He stared at the small book as if it were a snake. He didn't want to know, but he had to. With a shaking hand, he took it. His eyes scanned the final frantic entry. A strangled sob escaped his throat. The truth, brutal and undeniable, was right there in his mother's hand. "He told me. He told me she was weak," William whispered, his world crumbling around him. "He said she wasn't strong enough for this country." "He's a liar and a murderer," Catherine said, her gaze intense. "And right now, he's trying to murder the only man who has shown me any kindness since I came here. You can stop this, William. You can choose." From the trees, they heard a cry of pain. Daniel. He was hit. In that moment, everything changed for William. The years of fear, of abuse, of forced complicity, boiled over into a single defining choice. He looked at Catherine, his boyish face hardening into the expression of a man. "He won't hurt anyone else," he said. And he ran, not away, but toward the sound of the fighting. Catherine didn't wait to see what William would do. She raced after him, her mind a blank slate of pure animal instinct. She rounded a thicket of pine trees and saw it all unfold in a horrifying tableau. Daniel was on one knee, blood staining the snow around his leg, his rifle just out of reach. Marshal Brand was advancing on him, pistol raised, a cruel smirk on his face. Thomas Miller stood a few yards away, reloading his rifle, his back to them. "End of the line, Red Cloud," Brand sneered at Daniel. "Should have stayed on the reservation where you belong." He cocked the hammer of his pistol. This was it. It was over. "Pa!" William's voice was a raw scream of anguish and rage. Thomas Miller turned, a look of annoyance on his face that quickly turned to shock as he saw his son, rifle raised, pointing not at Daniel, but at him. "Boy, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" "Put that gun down," Thomas commanded. "She didn't run away," William sobbed, his voice cracking. "You lied to me. You killed her." Thomas's face went from shock to pure, cold fury. He leveled his newly reloaded rifle at his own son. "You're weak," he spat. "Just like her." Catherine saw it happen in slow motion. Thomas's finger tightening on the trigger. Brand turning, distracted by the family drama. It was the only opening she would get. She launched herself out of the trees, a desperate flying tackle aimed not at Thomas, but at the marshal. She crashed into Brand's side, sending them both tumbling into a deep snowdrift. His pistol went off, the shot going wild, echoing through the valley. As they struggled in the snow, Catherine clawing, kicking, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered animal, she heard another shot, a rifle shot. She twisted her head just in time to see Thomas Miller stagger backward, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He looked down at the red stain blossoming on his chest, then up at his son. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then he fell face first into the snow and was still. William stood frozen, smoke curling from the barrel of his rifle, his face a horrifying mask of grief and liberation. He had just killed his own father. Bran, enraged, threw Catherine off him and scrambled to his feet, raising his pistol to fire at William. But he wasn't fast enough. Daniel, who had managed to drag himself to his rifle, fired from his position on the ground. The shot hit Brand square in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the snow. He screamed in pain and collapsed, clutching his ruined arm. Silence descended. A heavy, ringing silence broken only by Brand's moans, William's ragged sobs, and Catherine's own gasping breaths. It was over. They had won. But the cost was staggering. She scrambled over to Daniel. The wound in his leg was bad, but the bullet had gone clean through. "It will heal," he grunted, tearing a strip of cloth from his shirt to make a tourniquet. She then went to William, who was staring at his father's body, the rifle hanging limply in his hands. She gently took the gun from him. "You did the right thing, William," she said softly. "You saved us. You saved your mother's memory." He just shook his head, unable to speak, the tears streaming down his face. They had to move, and fast. The gunshots would attract attention, and they had a wounded marshal and two bodies to deal with. And then, a new sound. Not dogs, not gunshots. Horses, a lot of them. Coming fast. Catherine's heart sank. Had Miller and Brand brought more men? Daniel grabbed his rifle, preparing for another fight. But the riders who burst into the clearing weren't thugs. They were dressed in buckskin and furs, their faces grim and determined. They were Lakota, Daniel's people. A dozen of them, armed and ready for battle. An old man with a face like a weathered map rode to the front. He looked at Daniel, then at the scene of carnage. "We heard the shots, Makpialuda," the old man said in their native tongue. "We feared the worst." Daniel managed a weak smile. "My friends came just in time, it seems." It turned out the sacred lake wasn't just a place. It was a community, a hidden refuge for Lakota who had refused to live on the reservations, who had chosen to keep the old ways alive. Daniel was their watchman, their protector. His solitary lodge was just an outpost. They had heard the prolonged gunfire and had come running, and they weren't the only ones. A few minutes later, another rider appeared. A white man, weathered and shrewd, leading a pack mule. Catherine recognized him from descriptions Daniel had given her. It was Jackson the trader. But the look on his face wasn't one of a simple trader. He dismounted and surveyed the scene with a professional, calculating eye. He walked over to the wounded Marshal Brand, looked down at him with contempt, and then pulled a second badge from under his coat. A federal marshal's badge. "Ralph Jackson, U.S. Marshals Service," he said, his voice hard as iron. "Brand, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and a dozen other things I'm gonna enjoy making stick." He looked over at Catherine, then at Elizabeth's diary, which she still clutched in her hand. "Looks like I got here just in time for the confession," he said. "I've been building a case against these two for years. Miller's crimes go deeper than you can imagine. Your diary, ma'am, is the final nail in his coffin." The world tilted on its axis. The traitor, their only link to the outside world, was an undercover federal marshal. He had known about Daniel. He had been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Catherine looked from the grim-faced Lakota warriors to the federal marshal, to the broken, sobbing boy who had just become a patricide to save them. Her escape from a cruel husband had triggered an avalanche, exposing a web of corruption and murder that ran deeper than anyone knew. She was free, but her simple flight for survival had just started a war. The aftermath was a whirlwind of chaos and grim necessity. Jackson, the federal marshal, was all business. With the help of the Lakota warriors, they secured the whimpering Marshal Brand, tying his hands and binding his shoulder wound as best they could. The bodies of Thomas Miller and the tracker were wrapped in canvas and loaded onto a spare horse. It was a grisly, silent procession. William was in a state of shock, moving like a sleepwalker. The old Lakota elder, whose name was Stone Bear, assigned two of his men to watch over the boy, not as a prisoner, but as a protector. They understood in a way Catherine was just beginning to, that the boy was a victim as much as a killer. He had slain the monster that had created him. Jackson explained everything as they worked. He had been sent from Washington to investigate rumors of corruption in the Montana territories. Brand's name kept coming up, always connected to land grabs, missing natives, and justified killings. And Thomas Miller was his biggest source of dirty money. "Miller wasn't just a homesteader," Jackson said, his voice low and gravelly. "He was running a criminal enterprise. He'd lure women out here with the promise of marriage, take whatever money they had, and then dispose of them. The isolation was the perfect cover. He buried at least 4 others on that property before your friend Elizabeth. Catherine felt sick. 4 other women, 4 other families back east who thought their daughter had simply stopped writing. She looked at Elizabeth's diary, its pages now stained with snow and blood. It was a testament, a voice for the dead. Daniel's leg was treated by Stone Bear with a mixture of herbs and prayers. It would be a long recovery, but he would walk again. As the Lakota helped him onto a horse, he looked at Catherine, his eyes conveying a universe of unspoken emotions. "You did not run," he said simply. It was the highest praise he could give. The journey to the sacred lake was slow and somber. It was a place Catherine had only heard about in whispers, a sanctuary. When they finally arrived, it took her breath away. Nestled in a high mountain valley, shielded from the world, was a crystal-clear lake surrounded by a vibrant, hidden community. It wasn't a village of teepees, but of solid, well-built lodges, smoke curling from their peaks, the scent of cooking fires in the air. This was the home Daniel had been protecting. Catherine, William, and Jackson were brought in as guests. For the first time in months, Catherine was surrounded by the sounds of a community. Children laughing, women talking, the rhythm of daily life. Anna, Stone Bear's granddaughter, took Catherine under her wing. She was a young woman with eyes that held an old wisdom. She helped Catherine tend to her bruises and cuts, and listened as Catherine finally, haltingly, told her full story. "You have the heart of a warrior," Anna said when she was finished. "You fought for the memory of those who were silenced." William was taken in by Stone Bear himself. The old man sat with the boy for hours, not speaking, just sharing the silence, letting the boy's storm of grief and guilt slowly exhaust itself. Jackson stayed for 2 days, taking official statements from Catherine and Daniel. He read Elizabeth's diary from cover to cover, his face grim. "This will be enough," he said. "With this, and Brand's confession, we can unravel Miller's entire network." Before he left, he made Catherine a promise. "Your testimony will be needed," he said, "but you will not have to go to Billings. I will bring the judge to you. Your safety and the safety of this community is my priority. You've exposed something rotten, Catherine. The territory owes you a debt." He also had a decision to make about William. Legally, the boy was a murderer, but Jackson was a man who understood that the law and justice were not always the same thing. His testimony against Brand is crucial, Jackson decided. After that, I'll recommend he be placed in the custody of his mother's family back in Pennsylvania. The boy has been through enough hell for one lifetime. After Jackson left with his prisoners and his grim cargo, a new kind of quiet settled over the sacred lake. It was the quiet of healing. Catherine spent her days learning the Lakota ways from Anna, helping Daniel as his legs slowly mended, and watching William begin to emerge from his shell of trauma. He started to talk, first to Stone Bear, then to Daniel, and finally to her. He told her about his mother, about the fear he had lived with his entire life, about the good and the bad of the man who was his father. As the snows began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared in the valley, a message came from Jackson. The trial was over. Brand had confessed to everything, implicating a dozen other officials in Miller's network. The story of the mail-order bride murders was a scandal that rocked the territory. Miller's ranch was dug up, and the remains of 6 women were found. Justice, slow and brutal, had finally been served. The message also contained news about William. His mother's family had been found. They wanted him. They were taking him back east, away from the ghosts of Montana. The day he left, escorted by 2 of Jackson's trusted deputies, was a day of sad goodbyes. He hugged Daniel. He bowed his head to Stone Bear, and then he came to Catherine. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." "You have nothing to be sorry for," she told him, putting her hands on his shoulders. "You have a second chance, William. Live a good life. That's the only justice that matters now." With William gone, and the threat of Thomas Miller finally buried for good, Catherine's future was a blank page. She was no longer a fugitive. She could go anywhere, back to Boston, west to California. But as she stood by the shore of the sacred lake, watching the sunset paint the water in the shades of fire and gold, she knew she was already home. Daniel came to stand beside her, his weight now steady on his mended leg. Jackson said there is a reward for the information you provided, he said. Enough money to start a new life anywhere you choose. I have a life, she said, looking not at the sunset but at him. Here, with you, if you'll have me. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his scarred features. The spirits led you here, Catherine Miller, he said, taking her hand. Who am I to argue with them? Their union wasn't marked by a church or a document. It was a simple ceremony, witnessed by Stone Bear and the entire community, under the vast, star-filled Montana sky. They were a family forged in violence and loss, but bound by something stronger, a shared resilience and a hard-won peace. Years passed, the railroad came, and the world outside the mountains changed. But at the sacred lake, they built a life. Catherine's skills as a seamstress found a new purpose, creating beautiful, blended garments for people in the nearby settlements who, like her, were navigating the space between two cultures. Daniel became a leader, a bridge between his people and the more honorable white settlers who came to the territory. And one clear autumn morning, the valley echoed with a new sound, the cry of a newborn baby, a daughter. They named her Elizabeth Sarah, for the two women whose memory had given Catherine the strength to fight. She had her father's dark, observant eyes and her mother's determined spirit. She was a child of two worlds, a symbol of a new future. One evening, as Catherine sat by the fire with her daughter sleeping in her arms, Daniel came to her with a small, leather-bound book. It wasn't Elizabeth's diary. It was new, its pages clean and empty. Every story has a beginning, he said, placing it in her hands. And every story deserves an end. Ours is just getting started. Catherine looked at the sleeping child, at the strong, kind man beside her, at the peaceful valley that was her home. The mail-order bride from Boston was a ghost, a memory from another life. In her place was Catherine of the Sacred Lake, a survivor, a partner, a mother. She had fled into the wilderness to escape a monster, and in doing so, she had found not just safety, but salvation. She had found her own magnificent country. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming up. And check out the 2 videos on your screen now for more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thanks for watching.